Let's now take a quick look at basic layout and spacing of your work. So you've finished your drawing, you've done your line art, the drawing is complete and it looks great, and you want to make sure that the layout on the page has done well. The first thing we want to be thinking about is page composition. So when we're putting stuff on a page to display, we're bound by the rules of that page, right? We're bound by the borders of the page. And this is called page-based composition, where the borders of the page are in fact an element of the design themselves as well, right? So when we're putting a single character on a page, or painting an environment painting or a landscape painting or doing a portrait painting, the actual borders of the page are actually part of the design as well. And so we want to use the negative space, we want to be thinking about the shapes of the negative space, and we want to try and design in this. Now, fortunately, there is a system called the rule of thirds that helps us easily lay out our content, our drawings, our paintings and whatnot in a logical fashion that is balanced, just following this simple rule. And you've probably seen this on your camera before, your phone camera. What it is essentially is a grid of 3 by 3 where the pages split equally into these 9 spaces. And what we want to focus on is these areas here, the intersecting points of these lines for our rule of thirds. Now, this of course depends on the type of composition you're going for. So a thirds-based composition would put the focal point of your character, usually their head, would try to keep the focal point of their character, your number one focal point, in one of these zones. So we're looking at a portrait orientation page here, and if we were going for a thirds-based composition, we would want to put this character, her name's Gwendia, we'd want to put Gwendia's head or focal points close to this number one, or in the area of this number one, or any of these, but at least one of them, right? We want the focal points to be at one point here. However, that's great. Perhaps you've got a character that fits in an L shape or something where that would make logical sense. But a lot of the times we're drawing our characters perhaps in a way where they're just a single character on the page. And so what we want to do is another type of composition, still using the rule of thirds though, called iconographic composition, where we try to keep the bulk of the character in the middle blocks, right? And so that's kind of Gwendia's composition here, but she's not properly or well composed on the page just yet, because there's something else we have to take into account apart from the page-based composition, and that is the space around the character. Too many times people will draw their characters kind of partially off the page, right, or too big or really too small, which is often occurrence as well, where there's this tiny little character in front of the page. And what you want to do is try to ensure that when you're laying out your characters, you're laying them out with adequate space around them. So kind of imagine them in a block, almost like this Photoshop block, for instance, where there's adequate space around them that will frame the character. All right. It's basically highlighting the character. The space is highlighting the character for the viewer. And it's making the viewer feel like things aren't going too crazy, that they've got space to contemplate the piece, that there's space around the character that is helping us focus on the elements of the character and not worrying about us reaching the ends of the page. Once again, remember, the borders of the page are in fact design elements of the page, and so is the spacing. It's a design element. So you want to see it as a thing that you want to try to use to enhance your piece. All right, and so here we've adjusted the spacing around Gwendia, and she looks much more evenly spaced now than she was before she was a little bit big. And then last but not least, you will want to probably put your signature or some kind of information on there, maybe the date and whatnot. And my advice here for you is try not to have your signature be too big or too small, and try to put it in a place that is not overly highlighted, or that is not overly in a focal point. For example, you don't really want to put I wouldn't want to put the signature here inside the loop of the hair braid, because the hair braid itself is creating a focal point out of the signature, and you want the signature to be seen, but it's not really part of the piece, right? So put it somewhere where it's kind of out of the way, but it can be near the piece, but somewhere where it's not going to necessarily be a focal point. I would avoid generally putting it just in the corners and things like that in these types of illustrations, right, where it really is going to be more beneficial if it's closer to the piece like that, and it makes the piece look more complete and more professional. All right, and that is pretty much it for our layout, basic layout and spacing of our characters. We want to remember the rule of thirds composition, iconographic composition, keeping good spacing around our characters, and then also ensuring that our signatures are not becoming focal points in our piece, our signatures or our marks or what have you. And let me say one final thing. If you are posting your work online or digitally, I would certainly recommend putting your website down at the bottom of the page here. I'm just typing mine out here. And putting it somewhere on the page, because of course in today's digital world, we've got people downloading and sharing and saving to their hard drives and various things. And having your website address there, your link there, especially if you're looking for freelance work, you want to get noticed in the industry, whatever industry, the film industry or the game industry, it's good to have a website on there. Once again, make sure it's not a focal point, and I would keep it fairly light. Just a way for people to know who did this. Even writing your name next to your signature is a good idea. All right, that's it from me for this lesson, and I will see you guys in the next module.